Hello, I'm Mary Ito, and welcome to the CRAM podcast. CRAM is an acronym for Communicating Research and More, which is what we try to do on this podcast. A lot of exciting research and groundbreaking ideas never reach the public, but they have the potential to change the way we think and act. How does war begin? Does it start with a declaration, an attack, an invasion? And what are the rules, if any, surrounding its onset and conduct? These are questions we may never have contemplated until now. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine has caused us to think about war, even the possibility of global war, and the stability of our world. Catherine Frost is a political science professor at McMaster University. She specializes in political thought and history, and she's here to talk about the history and politics surrounding declarations of war and how what precedes war can impact how war unfolds. Hi, Catherine. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Mary.
Why don't we start off with what actually is a declaration of war? I mean, how did it begin?
Well, declarations of war have been around basically since war itself has been around. There's always been an opportunity to talk to the other side and say, is what we're doing necessary? The Mesopotamians did declarations of war. We have clay tablets that record something like a declaration of war.
So how far back would that be?
Almost 4,000 years. So old,
okay.
quite
old, very ancient.
Even the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the oldest piece of literature we have on Earth, records something like a declaration of war taking place. So as long as there's been war, there's been some kind of related practice where people talked about why they were going to war. And the Greeks famously declared war on one another's, and the Peloponnesian Wars started when Sparta decided to declare war on Athens. And even the Romans thought it was a sacred duty. And they actually had a priesthood whose job it was to make sure that war was declared properly. And what these priests would do is they would and confirm that the cause was just, that the gods would favor it. And then once the decision had been made, they would go to the enemy frontier and they would sort of announce a set of demands that if the enemy was willing to meet, they didn't have to go to war. And then they would give them about 30 days, which is a lifetime by our standards, but they had 30 days to think on it. And if they didn't hear back with people agreeing to the terms, the priest would return to the borderlands and throw a bloody spear across. And that was it. You were at war with Rome.
Wow. So it was a really defined process that they followed.
Very.
And how much responsibility? I mean, I know you said, I guess they talked about it amongst themselves and it had to be a just war in their terms.
Yep.
But how much responsibility lay on them for this war?
A pretty extraordinary amount, really. I mean, the war itself would have been debated within Roman government, and the Senate would have had a say in it and so forth. But when it came down to the actual point of declaring war, the priests themselves, in going to the borderlands and carrying out these duties, one of the things they did was they issued a special oath called an execratio. And that oath is actually a kind of self-cursing. And it says, if this is not a just cause, if I am not bearing witness to something just, literally the text of the oath goes, the gods may bring down their wrath on Rome and obviously on the priests themselves. So they really understood that going into a war was a huge undertaking and a great responsibility, and there was a lot at stake, and they made it clear in those oaths.
Did anyone actually take personal responsibility if they lost the war?
There wasn't personal responsibility necessarily. I mean, we know what we know about the Fischl priests, which is this group of priests. We know from sort of occasional stories in Roman historians. But one of the things we do know that they did, and they did take these responsibilities seriously, is they were also responsible for making sure that war was carried out in a kind of appropriately civilized way. And if there were uh, generals who had sort of fallen short of Roman expectations, even in a war with an enemy, it was the job of the official priests to actually take that individual, hand them over to the enemy for punishment. So they were quite involved in sort of diplomatic responsibilities and engagement with the other side, even throughout the war and even after the war.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds pretty impressive. I mean, thinking back, thousands of years that they had already thought about that and a kind of a just system that would be involved. But part of me also thinks, well, why would you even want to warn your enemy that you're beginning a war? I mean, it seems kind of self-defeating to give them that alert.
Well, there's a couple of advantages to declaring a war before you get into it. One of them is you don't tend to get into wars by accident, where someone misinterprets. Say a soldier goes AWOL and picks a fight in another town. You want to be clear that wasn't us, starting a war. That was some guy, doing his thing.
Right?
Um, it also makes clear when a war begins and ideally when one ends. So again, there's a lot of neutral powers. It allows civilians, it allows bystanders kind of get their business in order and clear out of the way. So there's a clarity to getting into war itself. And then there's always the slim possibility, and you can see it in the Roman example, that by the time you've made clear this is really a big issue for us, and we're really willing to get involved in a struggle over this, that maybe the other side goes, well, maybe we can reach a compromise, maybe we can reach an understanding.
Mm,
So the declaration of
mhm.
war, in some cases, not in all cases, but in some cases, has this possibility of um, maybe being a way to talk yourself out of the inevitable.
But yeah, and then now that makes me think as well that if you're giving some time and the citizens can ready themselves and, businesses, et cetera, maybe you're also signaling to other perhaps neighboring states that this is going to happen. So just
Yes.
get ready,
Yes. And also,
right?
you're signaling a little bit to neighboring states. If you don't want to be part of this conflict, now is the time to back away. So, in other words, it signals neutrality. When you declare a war, you automatically sort of establish the category of neutral states, and people have to decide where they're going to be.
So yeah, and then what happened over time? Because obviously things evolved with declarations of war. Was it successful? Did it kind of evolve into something else?
Well, probably one of the biggest watersheds in terms of the way declaring war is a human practice would be in the 1600s. And the reason that was important is there was a series of treaties, a set of treaties called the Peace of Westphalia that happened in 1648. And it came on the heels of a religious war that had taken up about 30 years, and most European states got caught up in it one form or another. And people just wanted peace. They were exhausted. They wanted some solution to it. And so the Peace of Westphalia brought together basically most of Europe to negotiate some kind of an understanding that would, you know, settle what all of these conflicts. And in the process of that agreement, there was a kind of shifting of power and authority from the church or the individual kings or priests who had personally sort of, war was a very personal business at that point. It was one king declaring on another. And it became more a state-based activity, and it became more um, sort of the institution that we recognize as the modern secular state kind of has its roots in this period. And the reason that's important for declarations of war is that it's really from that point forward that it's quite clear that only states can declare war, and they can only declare war on other states. So it sort of stabilized this idea of sovereignty, that states are the institutions that do the business of war. And this became the kind of convention in the international order.
And I mean, was that why? Why did it come to that? To that sort of idea of states alone were able to declare war and only on each other?
I think part of it was the sense that the church and the religious wars were just simply unmanageable, and the states were willing to make kind of pragmatic compromises and solutions. There was a lot of religious tolerance that ironically came out of this agreement, where states that had, say, Protestant minorities were willing to sort of live with them, whereas the church, especially the Roman Catholic Church, was not as interested in those kinds of compromises. So
Mm.
you get the rise of that kind of the state as a different institution than, say, a church, or the personal kind of preferences of a prince and how they might want to run their affairs.
Yeah, okay. So then if that's the case, and it strikes me as there is this movement away from the religious foundation, right, of declarations of war that had historically existed,
Hmm.
then wouldn't that also mean the way declarations of war were made also would have changed? So how were they then? I mean, I can't imagine that it's priests going over now and there's a bloody spear being thrown.
No, we
Right?
tried to dial back the bloody spears. Um, it did become a much more formal process over time. And so the one of the kind of standard practices, especially after the Peace of Westphalia, after the 1600s, was that the declaration should be public. So it could be a public statement, it could be a speech, it could be a document that was handed over by an ambassador. Eventually, by the 20th century, it could be a radio announcement. But as long it's generally a public event, and that's one of the things that makes it quite different. It's not a personal letter from one prince to another saying we're
Hmm.
at war.
Yeah, so if it's public, that almost makes it seem there's even more onus, right, on the country that's making this public statement. However, I'm also wondering, if because you're not actually in war and you're just, well, not just, but you are making a statement, you can also use that to your advantage, right? It could be like it could be just a threat. Maybe you're just posturing. It's only being used as a tool, but really your intention is to not actually go into war. So did that how much misuse was there of the declarations of war?
Yeah, there was plenty. I can think of two instances. One that sort of fits the model you're talking about of sort of posturing and threats. That when in the Opium Wars in the 1840s, Britain was trying to push its trade relations with China and had some disagreements particularly over the opium trade and how merchants were behaving and so forth. And there was small skirmishes that sort of led to disagreements that became more and more complex. And eventually, the British decided that they would, in fact, use force in China, but they sort of announced that it shouldn't go much further than that. That they were willing to get into a war, but they were pretty sure that just the threat of it would cause China to back down, and it didn't. And there was a war. China eventually surrendered, and out of which we get modern day Hong Kong was one of the territories that was surrendered. But um, that does actually happen. There's another example, which is particularly egregious, where at one point a king of Sweden wanted to declare war on Russia in 1788. It was King Gustav III. And he couldn't declare war by himself. He actually needed the support of Parliament under their constitution. And so what he did was he arranged for some of his troops to dress as Russians and attack a Swedish town. And the outrage that caused gave him the extra support in Parliament to be able to go ahead and declare a war on Russia. So it was a complete false flag operation. So, a Declaration of Independence is not immune from being abused in many, many ways.
That's pretty crafty.
He
Yeah.
got, I mean, he got outed for it in the end, and he was assassinated by a soldier not long after the war ended. So
Hmm.
let's just say
So
it's not a recommended practice.
well, yeah, because it's kind of it's based on sort of this honor system, right?
It
That
is.
yeah, it's based on. But then again, you know, I I understand that there was this whole, Peace of Westphalia, and was there kind of a general agree I mean, who's there to monitor it? I guess that's what I mean. So you have is it just some kind of consensus? Was there a body that would oversee it? I mean, they didn't have the UN. So what like
No,
yeah,
no.
so right? Was it just up to the individual states that they were going to operate in this manner?
To a certain extent, but it's not entirely as simple as that. Because especially from something like the Peace of Westphalia, what you got out of that was a kind of growing internationalism, where the states were agreeing to try not to do these things, and if you were going to do them, as you say, not even just an honor system, but yet the kind of like a sense that there was kind of an ethic that you had to justify. And so, for instance, that part of the reason that King Gustav did what he did was so that he could say he was fighting a defensive war, not an offensive war. He wasn't starting it. He was sort of responding. So there was this sense that some kinds of wars maybe could be more understandable than others. And the real kind of there's no official policeman, there's no global institution that can kind of approve or disapprove of these
Mhm.
things, but there's an international community that has over time really taken a stake in how wars were undertaken, and sort of you don't want to be the bad guy, you don't want to be that state that is really acting out really too far from those international norms.
So then once that was established, in the 1600s, what happened after that? Was that system actually successful?
No, we had plenty of wars, but there was a sense that you had to give some account of. Now, not all of these wars were declared either. An awful lot for a long period. There were a number of undeclared wars, but there was a sense that there was a what gets called just war theory, that you actually could, in some cases, explain why you were getting into a war. And so there were often explanations. And sometimes a declaration of war could come after the war had started, and sometimes they weren't declared at all.
Mm. Do you know that's so interesting because then it also makes me think about how history is written, right? Because, if there's a declaration of war, and let's just say it's truthful and it was done in an honorable way and there was an actual war that was preceded by a declaration, that's one thing. But then when you talk about all these other wars where there was no declaration, but then there might have been a declaration after, like, and then one side says, no, that wasn't a war. And the other side said, yes, which is, of course, the case today. How does that get written up, right? How does all that get remembered and documented?
I suspect an awful lot of it has to do with who won.
Yeah.
Is the kind
Hmm.
of
Right.
pragmatic answer to that. Um, I'd say, though, that sort of lessons get taken from it in terms of, so take, for example, the Opium Wars, um, that there are some ways of going about it that don't reflect wonderfully on the states that were doing. Even during that period, there was a certain amount of unease among the British public, that they didn't like the idea that they were getting into a war to protect the trade in opium, which they recognized as a pretty devastating thing for people's lives. So it does matter. You are sort of observed not just by other states, but by populations. And it can be a heavy burden to be completely at odds with that.
Mm. So, I mean, it sounds as if it was kind of a mixed bag. And as you say, it wasn't really working because there were a lot of wars that ensued after that. What happened then, as far as changes then to declarations of war?
Well, there was actually a point at which an effort was made to require them, and to say you shouldn't enter a war without issuing a declaration of war that sets out your reasons. And that comes out of, again, the sort of the pattern of internationalism was throughout the 19th and then in the early 20th century an effort to uh, basically make war less awful and less horrible. It actually dates, for instance, to the foundation of the Red Cross. And one of the founding figures for that, a guy, Henry Dunant, who got sort of assembled a group together and got people to recognize the Red Cross emblem so that they could go onto the battlefields and recover the wounded who were otherwise up to that point basically being left there to die. And so that initiative to say war, it's in everyone's best interest that war not be absolutely horrible. If everyone wants to get their wounded off the battlefield once you've had a
Mm.
battle. So let's create those kinds of rules. And that starts to evolve. Eventually, it was actually Russia at one point in 1898 issued what's called the Rescript for Peace, which was basically an invitation from the Tsar to say, let's all get together and talk if we can, disarm, lower the chances of war taking place. Didn't quite turn out into, European disarmament, but it did gather an extraordinary range of states together. And they agreed on starting this principles of putting some rules around war itself, which then becomes a whole tradition of international humanitarian law. And out of that, we get the first Hague Convention. Then in the second Hague Convention, there's actually a requirement in 1907 that states not go to war without declaring war. And so it becomes an official part of kind of international legal practice at that point.
Mm. So that's okay. Let's just talk a little bit about these conventions then. And so they actually set up the laws surrounding what happens before war and then what happens when you enter war. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
So,
so
yeah. Yeah, tell us about that.
well, just what you sort of the distinction you made is traditionally an important one, which is between the laws that cover going to war, which is called sometimes use the Latin term jus ad bellum, and the laws that cover when you're actually in a war or during a war. And there's jus in bello, and they're slightly different. I mean, obviously, they both kind of address the whole process of war, but one is about the causes of war or going to war, and one is about the humanitarian efforts that can be made to make war less awful when one is actually happening.
And that came out of these conventions.
Yeah, I mean the idea that you should have a just cause for war, like I said, goes all the way back.
Right.
The Romans are essentially doing a version of that. The Mesopotamians do. The real focus, I mean, the idea of having laws in war that covered prisoners of war, civilians in war, all of these sort of things, that's really takes off in the 20th century. And you get a series of these conventions, get a series of the Hague Conventions, then you start getting the Geneva Conventions. There's a series of those, and they continue up to today. We have conventions that, for instance, try to ban the use of certain weapons. So we banned landmines, chemical weapons, biological weapons, cluster bombs. Now, each of these conventions, it depends what states sign on to them. So they're not always kind of 100% universal, but they are kind of an aspiration on the part of the world community to come together and do something useful. And a comparison might be, or one of the ways it might help to think about it, is to think about the way we do climate conferences now. And we gather states together and NGOs and a whole bunch of actors that can maybe make a contribution to solving things. And we set some goals, and
Right.
we don't always achieve the goals, but the process of doing it actually does kind of move the goalposts just a little bit. And that becomes important over the long term.
Well, so all this effort going into these conventions, starting from that initial one you talked about in Russia in the late 1800s, but then, even I mean with the Second Hague Convention, which was what, 1900 something or other, right?
1907.
Yeah. I mean, we got World War One after that.
True.
So what happened to all those good intentions?
Uh, Much like climate conferences, we haven't hit all our goals. Um,
Now, that's an interesting analogy you make to
yeah,
climate conference because we do keep having repeated climate conferences as well
yeah,
with
yeah,
very good intentions that not everybody follows.
and not everybody follows. But the response to not hitting the target can't be, let's not have the next convention. So I think the same approach was taken with these humanitarian laws. Was maybe you don't succeed in stopping every war, maybe you don't succeed in protecting every civilian or every prisoner of war, but you keep trying to establish this as the norm, and you keep trying to establish rules that are appropriate to the kinds of wars that you're fighting, because of course war evolves as the technology of war evolves.
Yeah, do you think there was enough attention paid to the aspects or the laws, I should say, the rules surrounding before you get into war as opposed to your conduct during war?
Uh, it's it's a difficult. I mean, there has been the field of just war theory. There's had a lot of work. Right. I mean, medieval thinkers were working on the questions of just war and so forth. So there's been a lot of attention to that. But an interesting kind of thing happened, especially with the introduction of the United Nations in 1945, because by 1945, after the war, there was again this kind of general exhaustion with war and a sense of let's not do that again. And so the United Nations, first the League of Nations, which was after World War I, and then the United Nations was an attempt to create another international institution that could divert use of force. And actually, the Article 2 of the UN Convention, so the sort of founding document of the United Nations, says, you will not use or threaten to use force against another member state. And so, again, if that had been made to stick, we would live in a very different world. But because you're not actually supposed to declare war in the period after the arrival of the UN, the progress on international humanitarian law continued, and so the laws during war continued to be refined. But the law of going to war, if you're not supposed to declare it at all, there's no need to kind of refine
Or
it
work
too
on that, you
much
mean?
to our work on it. Exactly. Which
Huh.
is not to say that it wasn't discussed.
Yeah.
The Security Council in the UN exists in a sense to take up the use of force problems that they knew would continue and that they needed to address. And in fact, the UN itself can authorize use of force and has on rare occasions done so. But the other beyond that, it really it wouldn't reflect well on a state to be out there declaring war too loosely. So that sort of stalled at
Hmm.
that point for you know for a reason that you can understand and appreciate.
So what I'm hearing is um, there's kind of a difference between the theory of what they
Mm,
wanted in the UN and then the
mm-hmm,
reality of what ends up happening, right?
mm-hmm.
In theory, there's supposed to not be any wars, right? And as you said,
Yeah.
there's the UN Security Council to handle that. But in fact, wars continued, right?
Yes.
Vietnam,
Yeah.
Korean War, Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. Well, all kinds of
Yes.
hundreds of wars since 1945.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think part of that, I mean, was it because I don't know, because there were no longer any declarations of war and because there wasn't enough effort put into, well, wars could still happen. So maybe we need to work on that.
I think it would probably go too far to say that not having the declaration as a commonplace diplomatic document probably fed some of these conflicts. We know that in a great number of these conflicts, discussions were going on beforehand, perhaps in some cases through the United Nations. Um, but what the absence of the declaration of war did in some of these cases is once you declare war, you automatically, these humanitarian laws that we have developed over the 20th century automatically kick in. You are required to comply with an awful lot of these particular measures. And when you don't have those, and because you don't have a state actually declaring war and making it official, it gets very murky as to when you actually kick in these rules. Now, the Geneva Convention of 1949 did say, look, it doesn't matter if you declare war or not, these rules apply. And so they apply simply when you've got an actual de facto conflict on the ground. But it
Mm.
does create a bit of a gray zone where states can say, we're involved in a police action, or we're involved in a war on terror rather than a war on another
Right.
state.
Yeah.
And it becomes just a little less crisp and clear. And there is that price. So rather than, I don't know that it necessarily, inflames conflicts that wouldn't have happened anyway. But what the conflicts that do happen lack a little bit of that kind of clarity and a little bit of the accountability that we might want of states that get themselves involved in these kinds of
Mm.
conflicts.
So, yeah, I mean, when you don't have declarations of war, well, first of all, it could be disputed. Is this a war? When did this war even begin? And then,
Yes.
as you say, all that murkiness around it, which I'm sure then influences post-war analysis of, war crimes, what was done. Was this justified? Was this not justified? Is that right?
Yeah. Yes. And there's a strange kind of uh, development that, along with the decline of the declaration of war, you also got a decline in the actual peace treaties that end war. So wars don't end as crisply as they used to, and you find yourself in a number of places around the world. We have what are called frozen conflicts, which are wars that started off, never got officially declared or never got handled kind of crisply, and therefore never really come to an end. A classic example of that is North and South Korea, which there was an armistice. The war broke out in 1950. There was an armistice. In other words, a ceasefire arranged in 1953, but they've never reached a peace agreement. And so technically they're still at war, and they are still trying for a peace agreement to actually put closure to the situation. But that's the kind of, the clarity about entering
Hmm.
and exiting war. Those, both ends have become kind of murky over time.
Yeah, I mean, just going back to, I guess there was no declaration of war for Vietnam, was there?
No, no,
And not Afghanistan either.
no, that was the war on terror,
Yeah,
which
right, the war on terror,
you
right.
can't declare war. Like I said, you're
Yeah,
supposed to declare war on other states.
right.
If you declare war on something like terror, the problem with that is, how do you know when you've won the war on terror? So it's potentially an open-ended kind of category, which can be a kind of that's certainly not what the declarations of war initially were used as. They're not meant to be a kind of
Hmm.
endless exercise.
Yeah, and that idea of the frozen conflict, that kind of you didn't have an official start, there's no sort of official end to it. Would the Israeli-Palestinian war conflict be part of that or
That would be
not?
a tricky one, because
Hmm.
the way it started was not necessarily to a state that could declare war on another state, because you had the Balfour Declaration. The British were sort of involved at the early stages of it. But I have seen it sort of talked about as a frozen conflict. It's not. It
Hmm.
is in some ways an intra-state conflict, because the Palestinians have not been recognized as having their own state. So it's not a
Mhm,
state to state
mhm,
conflict the way
mhm.
North and South Korea would be. But it could certainly be one of those situations where we definitely had conflict. We definitely had use of force. We definitely have communities that are sort of trapped in an unresolved situation as a result of it. Um, and there's still a lot of work to be done on reaching some kind of mutually accepted peace.
Yeah, that's a tough one too, isn't it? Because the UN, that has the out, right? Uh, the out of the fact that if you are attacked, if a state is attacked, then you can go to war. Isn't that right?
Yes,
Yeah.
there is a thing called Article 51, which allows states to still retain some sliver of autonomy and sovereignty over their own use of force, which is to say,
Hmm.
if you are the subject of an armed attack, you can go to war, but you have to immediately notify the Security Council. And ideally, the hope is that that conflict can be kind of rooted back into the United Nations and resolved through diplomacy rather than through violence.
But again, it's really murky because what if you're not a state? What if you're a people and you are attacked, but you are not officially a state?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of the frozen conflicts around the world involve areas that did, for instance, a declaration of independence that maybe wasn't welcomed or accepted by the state from which they wanted to exit. And then if they aren't sort of embraced or recognized by the international order, you get this kind of sort of limbo scenario. Kosovo is in that situation to a certain degree. It declared independence from Serbia, but has been sort of recognized by about half of the states. Has a kind of half in, half out. It's not an official member of the UN, but
Right.
it does participate in some of the work of the UN.
Right.
And
So
so,
do you mean, sorry, do you mean that it's only recognized by about half of the UN members?
yes,
Yeah, right. So how many does it take for it to be recognized as a state?
nobody nobody knows.
Nobody knows?
We don't have an official count. I mean, it's usually what happens is you either have states that have a limited amount of recognition. So, for instance, there are some former Soviet territories that have declared independence, like South Ossetia, Nagorno Karabakh, and so forth. And some of these are recognized by Russia as independent, but pretty much nowhere else. This is the situation in Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk. They're recognized by Russia, but nowhere else. And those
Mm,
are not really considered, they're frozen conflicts in the sense, well, Crimea is unfreezing rapidly. Um, but in some of these other places, the conflict has kind of stalled and you don't have a new independent state out of it because you don't have enough recognition. And so in other cases, states are sort of just generally accepted and most states recognize, and there's really no controversy to them joining the UN and being recognized independently. But every state makes a decision about recognizing another new state. So it's a one by one process.
hmm. I just want to touch now on Russia that did
Hmm.
not make any official declaration of war.
Hmm.
And I guess they didn't make it either in what was it in 2014, right? When this first started, when they,
No,
yeah,
no.
went into Ukraine. Um, but he did make some kind of a statement to the public, in fact. So what do you make of all that?
I mean, it's kind of fascinating because, like I said, that you're not supposed to be doing declarations of war, and but there was this public announcement shortly before Russia began crossing the border, and there was action in Ukraine. There was use of force in Ukraine, um, and in that announcement, Putin explained what he saw as the motives for the justifications for this action. I don't know that it has been particularly well received. For instance, one of the things he said was there was a Nazi-led genocide going
Hmm.
on in eastern Ukraine in certain regions. That has been disputed by the Ukrainians themselves at the International Court of Justice. And actually, Russia has backed down on that claim and said, well, actually, that wasn't the reason we're going in. Um, so it does matter what explanations you give because you may be held to account for it. On the other hand, he was very careful not to say that this was a war. He called it a special military operation, and
Right.
by choosing that language, avoided all of the obligations, and not entirely avoided. I mean, certainly, the International Criminal Court has already opened an inquiry into whether there are war crimes taking place.
Okay, so let
So
me stop you with that. So
yeah,
see, this is interesting. So Putin describes the invasion as a special military operation.
yeah,
Ukraine and other countries have called it a war,
yes,
right? So we have a difference of opinion there.
yep.
But then with this, is it the court?
So there's the
The
International Court of
right,
Justice,
right.
and
So
then
they
there's the International Criminal Court. They're two separate courts.
Okay, and which one is it? Now they're looking into the war crimes.
The International Criminal Court looks into war crimes.
Okay, so because they are actually calling it war crimes, they're not calling it crimes of a special military operation.
True.
So,
True.
what does that? Yeah, what does that
Yeah.
signify then? Is that kind of the accepted now term, and that in fact it is a war by a number of countries because they adhere to that
Yes, it's
court, right?
certainly Ukraine is experiencing it as a war and has called it a war,
Hmm.
and that matters. And when you have, as you say, the criminal court looking into it as a war, and can it, assuming they can establish the existence of certain war crimes, then it becomes a kind of moot issue. You are actually dealing with a war at that point. Um, but what you have is also uh, one of the states involved in it basically denying that they were ever in a war in the first place.
Yeah. There's always going to be, or I think there's always going to be a difference of opinion when it comes to war. Do you not? Do you think so? I mean, whether it's a just war, whether it's regarding the onset of war, war itself, the outcome of war, it's a messy, complicated business.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, no one who has a war declared on them tends to go, oh, that's a fair point. Go ahead. Everyone who is on the receiving end of a declaration of war or simply of armed aggression is probably going to disagree with it fairly strenuously. So that's the importance of having structures around the whole experience and activity. If we can't actually silence war, and that's a great aspiration, and we've been trying for a while,
Mhm.
mixed results. But if you can't actually silence war, the next best thing is to establish some practices that sort of set guardrails around the actual experience of war. And so that's kind of a second best, but it is kind of where you land if you can't actually silence war itself.
What have we lost and gained by not having declarations of war? I mean, I don't know, is that something we need to go back to, or is it something in its place?
I don't think you necessarily have to be, I don't think anyone needs to be nostalgic for the declaration of war. Um, if we could actually stop wars,
Well, sure.
that would be the best. That would be
Yeah.
option A. We'll
Yeah.
go with option A. Um, but the reality is, as I said, mixed results on that one. We don't necessarily get
I mean, there are hundreds of
succeed in
wars
every
going
case.
on still,
Yes,
including Ukraine. Yeah.
yes, and all of these unresolved wars that never
Right,
kind of
right.
reached an end. Um, so if you can't do that, then I think the thing that the declaration of war was able to do was try and create some structure, try and remind the states involved that there was accountability, that you can't just sort of rush in, that you're supposed to be able to account for what you're doing. And it encouraged uh, whoever might have thoughts in this direction to stop and take it seriously and to think, is this really the step you want to take? You're at the brink of something really horrible. Do you really want to go ahead and pursue that? And so, and that's on top of all of the other advantages of like warning people, giving people an opportunity in some cases, if there's enough time to
Hmm.
sort of prepare to clear civilians out of the way. Um, those are advantages, but some of those things can be, uh, you know, disagreements can be worked out through the UN. You can still take it. That's an institution that you can still use for diplomacy. So the important thing is that the functions that the declaration of war served need to continue to function in some other way, even with a new international structure.
Do you think that hmm, once this current situation, the war in Ukraine, is resolved, that there will be, I guess, a review or I mean, would it be possible that the UN and countries involved would look back to the onset of war and the conditions surrounding entering war? I mean, just as you are saying, is that something you think that realistically is possible?
I think it'll depend on the participants because, I mean, some of this reflection that you're talking about really depends on our people or states willing to be accountable and to willing to talk about doing things differently.
Hmm.
Um, there's no question that it does call on us to think about the role of the United Nations because it is supposed to be the institution that prevents these kinds of outcomes. And so when something as difficult as what's happening in Ukraine, but there's, as you say, many other
Yeah.
states, many other peoples have experienced
Yeah.
this level of violence or worse. Um, and so the, the the challenge is, can we think about those things? Can we get the parties involved to come back to the table and to start thinking about a different model and a different way of doing things? And as with the kind of tradition of internationalism, that can be a slow, frustrating process. It can be very gradual. It can take the patience of a saint to kind of unfold these things over generations. But it's absolutely important work to do, and the goal has to be moving away from a model based on conflict to a model based on some kind of diplomacy.
This has been a wonderfully enlightening conversation, Catherine. A great history lesson for sure, and it just puts into context so much of the situation today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mary.
Catherine Frost is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at McMaster University. If you'd like to know more about her work, you can check out our show notes. And that is it for this edition of the Cram Podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. Our thanks to the Temerty Foundation for their generous support of this podcast. You might also be interested in our literary podcast. It's called Passage to Wonderland. I highlight compelling passages from books that offer discovery, insight, and a sense of completion for the end of your day. You'll find Passage to Wonderland wherever you get your Cram podcast. Thanks very much for joining us. See you next time.